The conference room still smelled like burnt coffee when it happened. I had been in that room 100 times before. For system reviews, budget meetings, the occasional fire drill of a crisis that only I knew how to put out. I knew every scratch on that table, every flicker of the fluorescent light in the corner that nobody ever fixed. Felt familiar. Safe even. Then Mr. Harmon slid the folder across the table. Not to me. To the kid sitting 2 seats down. The one with the university sticker on the back of his laptop and a lanyard badge that said Intern in bold black letters. The kid looked about 20 years old. Maybe younger. His hands were actually shaking when he reached for the folder. "Congratulations," Mr. Harmon said, smiling like I wasn't sitting right there. "You'll be leading the system transition." My stomach dropped straight through the floor. I didn't move. Didn't speak. My fingers were still hovering over my keyboard. Still logged into the very infrastructure they were now handing over to a college kid who looked like he had never seen a production environment in his entire life. What in the world had just happened to me? My name is Amber Collins. And the system they just gave away like a party favor? I built it. Every single piece of it. 6 years ago, I walked into Harlow Tech as a junior systems engineer. The legacy platform was already a mess when I arrived. Outdated code layered on top of older code, patched together with solutions that made sense in the moment, but created problems nobody wanted to face later. Nobody else wanted to touch it. Nobody wanted to spend their career buried in something that invisible. But I did. I spent 6 years learning every corner of that system. Every workaround, every fragile connection, every silent rule that kept it running when it should have collapsed long ago. I worked nights when the servers went down. I answered calls at 2 in the morning during client emergencies. I skipped vacations, shortened weekends, and once spent an entire New Year's Eve debugging a data migration that nobody else even knew was happening. My name never appeared in a press release. There were no company announcements about the work I did. But when something broke, they called me. Always me. Everyone in the room started clapping. I didn't. The intern Cody, his badge said, looked like he was about to pass out from anxiety. His eyes darted around the table, trying to read the room, trying to figure out if this was really happening to him. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "This is a great opportunity for the department," Mr. Harmon continued, leaning back in his chair with the satisfied look of a man who believed he had just solved a very expensive problem. "We're excited to bring fresh energy to the platform." Fresh energy. 6 years of my life, and that was the language they chose. Fresh energy. Then Mr. Harmon looked directly at me, and his smile didn't waver for even a single second. "Amber," he said, "you'll help Cody with the transition, of course. Show him the ropes. Make sure everything is properly handed over before you go." He said it like it was the most normal request in the world. Like he was asking me to show the new guy where the printer was located. Like he wasn't asking me to smile through the process of training my own replacement. I looked right back at him. "Of course," I said. That same afternoon I lost my admin access. No warning. No email. No conversation. Just an error message sitting in the middle of my screen where my full dashboard used to be. Access denied. Insufficient permissions. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I tried refreshing the page the way you do when you are hoping a problem will disappear if you ignore it long enough. It didn't. The error message sat there, patient and final, like a door that had been quietly locked while I wasn't paying attention. I checked my email. Nothing from IT. Nothing from HR. Nothing from Mr. Harmon. I walked down to the IT department and found the technician at the front desk, a quiet guy named Pete who had always been easy to talk to. I asked him whether there had been some kind of system update that affected my account. He looked uncomfortable right away. He clicked around on his screen for a few seconds, then said there had been a permissions restructuring requested by management that morning. He couldn't look me in the eye when he said it. I thanked him and walked back to my desk. This wasn't a restructuring. This wasn't an accident or an oversight or an administrative mistake. This was removal. Deliberate, quiet, and already well underway. I wasn't supposed to see the email thread. It came through on a group chain, one of those long corporate threads where someone always accidentally hits reply all, instead of forwarding it the correct way. My name was buried in the recipient list under about 14 others, added by mistake when someone copied the wrong distribution group. I almost deleted it without opening it. The subject line stopped me cold. Cost optimization. Q3 personnel review. I opened it. 3 paragraphs down I found my name. Highlighted. A. Collins, high dependency risk. Single point of failure. Recommend transitioning responsibilities to lower cost resource. Intern pipeline viable. Estimated cost reduction. Significant. I read that paragraph 3 times without moving. High dependency risk. That was how they described 6 years of building something nobody else had been willing to build. That was the official language they used to justify replacing me, not because my work wasn't good but because it was too good. Because I had become too important and important people cost money. Intern pipeline. That phrase. That was me. That was my entire replacement plan in 2 words. They had been meeting about this for months. And they had never said a single word to my face. The next morning I brought Cody coffee. He was sitting at the temporary workstation they had set up for him near the server room. A borrowed desk with an extra monitor and a stack of old system manuals that nobody had opened in years. His laptop was open, his eyes were wide, and he looked exactly like someone who had just been handed a map to a city that no longer existed. Figured you could use this, I said, setting the cup down beside his keyboard. He looked up, clearly surprised. He had probably been expecting hostility from me. Most people in my position would have given him exactly that. Thanks, he said. I really appreciate it, honestly. I don't understand most of what I'm looking at yet. Like any of it. He said it openly without pretending. No arrogance, no false confidence. Just a 20-year-old kid who had been dropped into something way over his head by people who didn't actually care what happened to him, any more than they cared what happened to me. I nodded slowly and looked at his screen. I know you don't understand it, I thought to myself. That is exactly why I stopped being angry at you. My anger had found a much better address. I want to be clear about something important. The system was not just code. If it had been clean, modern, well-built software, any competent engineer could have picked it up within a few weeks. That is not what I was dealing with. What I had spent 6 years maintaining was something entirely different. A layered patchwork of decisions made by engineers who had left the company years before I ever arrived, each one adding their own logic on top of someone else's layer, like coat after coat of paint on a wall that was never meant to carry that kind of weight. There were workarounds inside workarounds. There were functions that only ran correctly under very specific conditions that nobody had ever written down because the person who first discovered them assumed they were obvious. There were silent rules, invisible limits, triggers that would break the entire processing chain if someone touched them in the wrong order. I had learned all of it. Not from documentation. There wasn't any real documentation when I arrived. I had learned it through years of careful watching, patient testing, painful failing, and quiet fixing. There was no manual that covered what I knew. The manual was me. And that manual was about to go completely dark. 2 days after the transition meeting, Mr. Harmon called me into his office. He was sitting behind his desk with the easy confidence of a man who had already made his decision and simply needed the paperwork to follow behind it. He gestured to the chair across from him and I sat down. "We want to make sure this goes smoothly," he said. "I'd like you to put together complete documentation for the system. Everything Cody would need to keep things running properly on his own." I kept my expression completely neutral. "Of course," I said. "What format works best for the team?" He waved his hand loosely. "Whatever makes sense. Step-by-step guides. Process flows. Anything you think is necessary." Whatever I thought was necessary. That phrase sat between us like a quiet joke that only I could hear. For 6 years he had never once asked what I thought was necessary. Not once. Now, with the transition already underway and his intern staring blankly at my life's work, suddenly my judgment was being invited into the conversation. I picked up my notepad and wrote down everything he asked me to produce. "I'll get started today," I told him. And I did. I want to be completely honest about what I decided in that moment. I decided not to fight, not to argue, not to complain loudly, not to threaten anyone, and not to warn them about what was coming. I had watched other people in my exact position do all of those things, and I had seen how it ended for every single one of them. They got walked out of the building early. They lost their professional references. They left with nothing except the permanent reputation of being difficult, ungrateful, and bitter. The company moved on without missing a single step. And those people were the ones left alone holding all the damage. I was not going to be that person. So I made a completely different choice. I sat down at my desk and I started writing documentation. Clean, clearly organized, properly formatted guides. I wrote exactly what Mr. Harmon had asked me to write, following the scope he had described word for word, task by task. Every process I described was real. Every step I included was accurate. I didn't lie, I didn't plant errors, I didn't delete any files or corrupt any data. I simply wrote what they had asked for. Nothing more. And nothing less. The gap between those two things was everything. Here is something most people outside the technology world never understand about documentation. You can write a guide that is technically correct from the very first line to the very last. Every step listed in the right order, every command spelled out carefully, every process clearly labeled, and that guide can still be completely useless to someone who does not understand the background behind it. It is like writing directions to a specific location without mentioning that one of the main roads floods completely every time it rains heavily. The directions are not wrong. The road is still there on the map. But the person following your instructions is going to end up sitting in water, staring at the page, wondering what they missed. I wrote clean, organized, well-formatted guides. I documented every standard process Cody would need for daily operations. I covered the basics, the regular maintenance tasks, the things that ran smoothly under normal conditions. But the real knowledge, the understanding that had built itself inside me after 6 years of close experience, could not be transferred into a document, even if I had genuinely wanted to transfer it. The instincts, the pattern recognition, knowing that a specific slowdown at a specific hour of the night meant a particular part of the system was about to fail. Knowing which error messages to investigate immediately, and which ones could safely wait until morning. That knowledge was not stored in any document. It never had been. For 2 weeks, Cody sat beside me every single day. He was genuinely trying, and I want to be fair about that. He arrived early every morning, filled notebook pages with careful notes, and asked thoughtful questions for someone his age. Under completely different circumstances, I might have actually enjoyed being his teacher. He had real instincts for someone just starting out. But the system was not built for someone just starting out. What happens if the overnight sync process fails? He asked one afternoon, his pen hovering above his notebook. It almost always catches itself, I said. There's a retry sequence built directly into the system. And if the retry fails? That almost never happens, I said. He nodded and wrote it down. I was not lying. The retry sequence truly almost never failed. What I did not mention was the specific condition under which it absolutely would fail. A particular combination of update type deployed during a particular time window, which triggered a memory conflict that the retry logic had never been designed to handle. I did not volunteer that information. He did not ask the right question. And I had learned a long time ago that in this company, if you needed to know something truly critical, you had to ask exactly the right question. Nobody had taught me that. I had figured it out entirely on my own. 3 weeks into the transition, Cody deployed his first independent update. It was a small one. A minor patch to the reporting module that had been sitting in the release queue for several weeks. Mr. Harmon had approved it. The IT team had reviewed and signed off. Cody had read through the documentation carefully and followed every step I had written, in exactly the right order. I knew about it before he pushed it live. He mentioned it to me that morning, clearly proud of himself for handling something without needing to ask for help. I told him it sounded straightforward. That evening, I sat at home with my personal laptop open and pulled up the external system monitoring dashboard. I still had read-only access to the public-facing logs. No one had thought to revoke that specific permission during the restructuring. I watched the update deploy at 9:17 in the evening. Then I watched the cascade begin. It was subtle at first. A slight delay in the overnight sync process. A small memory conflict that the retry logic could not resolve because the update had been deployed during the exact time window I had never included in any documentation. I watched the logs quietly for about an hour. Then I closed my laptop and went to bed. By the next morning, the first signs were appearing throughout the office. I arrived at my usual time and settled at my desk. Within 20 minutes, 3 different colleagues had stopped by to ask if I had heard anything about the reporting system behaving strangely overnight. I said I hadn't been looped in on anything. By mid-morning, the operations team was on a conference call trying to understand why the overnight reports had not generated correctly. Data was lagging noticeably behind. Several client-facing dashboards were displaying figures that were more than 12 hours out of date. Mr. Harmon sent a message to the general team channel asking for a status update. His tone was still calm at that point. He wasn't alarmed yet, just doing the visible management thing of appearing to be in control of a situation he didn't yet realize was serious. Cody was at his workstation, pulling up logs, flipping through the documentation pages, working through it methodically. He looked pale but focused. He was genuinely trying to find the problem. I answered my emails, reviewed some unrelated files. Someone brought donuts to the break room, and I went and got one. Probably just a sync hiccup, one of the senior managers said during the afternoon stand-up meeting. I nodded along with everyone else. Probably, I agreed. By 3 o'clock that same afternoon, the word hiccup no longer applied to anything that was happening. Client-facing dashboards had gone from noticeably lagging to completely frozen. The reporting module that Cody's update had touched was producing error outputs instead of actual data. 3 enterprise clients had already contacted the account management team directly, asking for an explanation about what had happened to their numbers. The operations floor got loud in a way it rarely ever did. Voices sharpened. People pulled chairs into tight clusters, typing fast and talking faster, trying to pin down the exact source of the problem. By 4 o'clock, Mr. Harmon's office door was shut, which in 6 years I had learned only happened during the most serious conversations. At 5, my phone buzzed with a calendar notification. Emergency review, conference room B. Immediate. I picked up my notebook and walked down the hallway. When I pushed open the conference room door, 8 people were already inside. The operations lead, 2 members of the IT team, the head of client services, who looked exhausted despite it being only late afternoon, the finance manager at the side wall, and Mr. Harmon at the head of the table, and Cody sitting very still in the far corner chair, his face completely drained of color. Then every single person in that room turned and looked directly at me. The room was completely quiet when I sat down. Not the comfortable kind of quiet. The kind that settles over a group of people when everyone knows something has gone seriously wrong and nobody wants to be the first one to say exactly how wrong it really is. Mr. Harmon leaned slightly forward. "Amber," he said, "what are we looking at here? What's causing this?" I held his gaze for a moment without answering right away. Not long enough to be dramatic about it. Just long enough to let the question sit in the air for a full second before I responded. Then I tilted my head slightly toward the corner of the room. "Cody managed the most recent update," I said. "The one that went live yesterday evening." The room shifted immediately. Heads turned toward Cody. The operations lead pulled something up on his laptop. The client services director's expression changed in a way that told me exactly what she was calculating in her head. Nobody spoke to me again after that. They started directing their questions toward Cody instead. I opened my notebook to a blank page and held my pen above it, ready and attentive, the way a person looks when they are there to be helpful. I was careful to appear cooperative. I was careful not to say a single word that nobody had directly asked me to say first. That was all it took. Cody's voice stayed steady throughout, which I genuinely respected. He could have completely fallen apart in that room. He was 20 years old, surrounded by department heads and senior managers and a finance director, who was clearly already calculating revenue loss numbers on a private spreadsheet. He was being asked to explain why a company's client-facing system had effectively stopped working. Most people twice his age would have collapsed under that pressure. Instead, he sat up straight in his chair and walked them through exactly what he had done step by step. "I followed the documentation," he said clearly. "Every step in the right order. I have my notes here. Every action I took is logged and time-stamped." He pushed his notebook toward the center of the table without hesitation. Mr. Harmon picked it up, flipped through several pages, and his expression stayed controlled. But I could see something changing slowly behind his eyes. The documentation stated this update type was safe to deploy during the standard maintenance window, Cody continued. I followed every step exactly as they were written. Silence settled over the table. The IT lead looked at me. The operations manager looked at me. I looked down at my notebook, Cody was telling the complete truth. Every single step he had followed was exactly what I had written down for him. That was the problem. And that was also precisely the point. After the meeting broke up, Mr. Harmon found me in the hallway. He looked different from how he had looked in that conference room 3 weeks earlier when he was sliding folders across tables. The easy confidence had drained out of him. There was something tighter in his jaw now, something much more careful in the way he was choosing each word before he said it. "Amber," he said, "I know this situation is complicated, but we need to move fast here. The clients are escalating rapidly. We have enterprise accounts that are now actively threatening to pull their contracts." I waited and let him finish. "Is there any chance you could take a look at what's happening? Just to help us get a handle on the real scope of the damage. Just take a look. Just help us out for a moment. Just do this one small thing." I had spent 6 years doing just one more thing for this company. Staying late on Friday nights because nobody else was available. Coming in over weekends because something couldn't wait until Monday morning. Being reachable at 2 in the morning because the system never stopped running, and apparently neither did I. And then they had replaced me with an unpaid intern and revoked my access without a single direct conversation. Now they were standing in a hallway asking me to just help out. I took a slow, quiet breath. "I'd genuinely like to help," I said. "But there's a significant problem." I said it as calmly as I could. "I don't have system access anymore." 3 full seconds of silence passed. Then Mr. Harmon blinked. "What do you mean?" "My admin credentials were revoked 3 weeks ago," I said. "The day after the transition meeting in the conference room. I can't log into the production environment at all. I can't even view the internal dashboards." I watched the realization travel slowly across his face. IT had revoked my access as a standard part of the transition procedure. Efficiently, promptly, exactly as they had been instructed to do. Nobody had stopped to think about what that would mean if something went wrong during the handover. Nobody had considered the possibility that an unpaid intern, no matter how willing and hardworking, might not be capable of managing a cascade failure in a system that had taken a trained engineer 6 full years to truly understand. They had removed the only person who could fix the problem they were now facing. And they had done it entirely themselves. "We can restore it," he said quickly. "Temporarily. Just long enough for you to." "Mr. Harmon." I kept my voice completely even. "I have been formally separated from this system through your own process. Any access restoration would need to go through the proper channels. And honestly, temporary access isn't going to be sufficient for what you're describing here." The hallway felt very still. The second emergency meeting happened at 7 o'clock that evening. It was no longer just department heads and operations managers. 2 of the company's 3 executive directors had dialed in remotely, their faces arranged across the conference room screen in small squares. The head of finance was present in person at the far end of the table, a printed spreadsheet face down in front of her that nobody else could read. I sat near the middle of the table, not at the head of it and not in the corner, right in the center, where everyone in the room could see me without turning their heads. The executive team had been fully briefed on the situation. The system failure had now stretched past the 24-hour mark without resolution. 3 enterprise clients had submitted formal escalations in writing. One had specifically used the word contractual in their communication to the account management team. Revenue impact was discussed openly. Numbers were spoken aloud that I had never heard mentioned in any room I had previously been invited into. The finance director looked at her spreadsheet. Then she looked at me. Mr. Harmon did most of the talking. He explained the access situation. He explained the transition plan. He walked through what had happened with the update. He never once used the words intern or cost optimization. But I watched the executives on the screen as they listened to him. And for the first time since that folder had slid across the table, I saw something entirely new in the faces around me. Fear. After the executives ended the video call, Mr. Harmon turned to face me. The conference room had mostly cleared out. It was just the 2 of us and the operations lead, who was very deliberately pretending to type something urgent on his laptop at the far end of the table. "Amber," Mr. Harmon said quietly. He had completely dropped the casual, confident tone. "We need you. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Whatever it takes to restore your access and get this system stabilized, We are prepared to make that happen immediately. I nodded slowly. I had been thinking about this exact conversation for 3 weeks. I had rehearsed what I would say and how I would say it. I had written out my terms in my notebook 2 days after I first read the cost optimization email, updated them once more after I watched the cascade failure unfold from my home, and read through them again that same morning before I left my apartment. I was ready. I appreciate that, I said, and I am willing to help stabilize the system. But I am not willing to do it on informal or verbal terms. If I am being asked to come back and fix this, I need a formal written contract in place before I touch anything. I folded my hands calmly on the table. I'll send you my terms tonight. The operations lead had stopped pretending to type. They took 5 hours to respond to what I sent them. 5 hours during which the system continued to fail steadily, the client escalations continued to grow louder, and the finance director apparently had a second conversation with the executive team that I was not part of, but heard about through a message from a former colleague who was watching everything unfold from across the office floor. I sat at home with my laptop open and my notebook beside me, and I watched the clock move. At midnight my phone rang. It was Mr. Harmon. "We've reviewed what you sent," he said. His voice was flat in a way it had never been in any conversation we had ever had before. All the warmth was completely gone, but the resistance was gone too. What remained sounded like a man reading carefully from a script that someone else had handed him under serious pressure. "The executive team has reviewed and signed off. We are prepared to meet your terms." He did not say congratulations this time. He did not smile. This was not a folder being slid across a conference table to a nervous intern with a campus sticker on his laptop. This was a company on its knees. "I'll have my attorney review the contract in the morning," I said. "Once it's signed, I'll come in." "Morning." A brief pause. "We were hoping tonight." "Morning," I said firmly. "Good night, Mr. Harmon." My terms were not complicated. They were simply fair, the kind of fair that should have been there from the very beginning. First, triple my previous annual salary, structured as a consulting rate for the full stabilization period, paid in advance. Second, complete decision-making authority over any system changes during that period. No management approvals required for technical decisions. My judgment final with no override. Third, no transfer of system ownership, documentation, or access credentials to any other party, including Cody, during the active contract period. And fourth, the condition that mattered most to me personally, my formal resignation from Harlow Tech, effective immediately upon successful stabilization and handover confirmation. A clean, complete, and permanent separation. No extensions, no counteroffers, no follow-up conversations about staying on in any capacity. I was not going back to work for them. I was going back to finish what they had broken through their own arrogance. Those were two very different things. My attorney reviewed the full contract at 8 the following morning. She made 2 focused adjustments to the payment structure, and flagged one clause she said was worded too loosely. We sent the revised version back by 9:30. By 10 o'clock it came back to us signed. All 3 executive signatures at the top. Mr. Harmon's name at the bottom. I read through the entire document twice. Then I got dressed and drove to the office. I walked back into the building at 10:45 that morning. Pete from IT was standing near the front desk with my access credentials already prepared and waiting. He handed me the login card without making eye contact, the same way he had looked away when he told me about the permissions restructuring 3 weeks earlier. "Good to have you back," he said quietly. I thanked him and went straight to the server room workstation. I didn't stop to talk to anyone. I didn't visit the break room or check in at my old desk or make any kind of entrance. I logged in, pulled up the full system logs, and started working through the failure chain from the beginning. It took me roughly 40 minutes to completely map what had happened. The cascade was exactly what I had known it would be the moment I watched Cody's update deploy. The memory conflict triggered by the specific time window, exactly the condition I had carried in my own head for years because it had never seemed necessary to write it down for anyone else. I resolved it in under 3 hours. Not because I was trying to make a point about it. Because I knew that system better than I knew the layout of my own home. When the dashboards turned green across the board, nobody in the room cheered. They simply stared at their screens, quietly breathing again. I closed my laptop, opened my email, and submitted my resignation letter. I left the building the following morning. There was no gathering, no card being passed around for people to sign, no speech in the conference room with lukewarm coffee and someone's grocery store cake. I didn't want any of that. I walked in, collected the few personal items remaining at my old desk, a notebook I had filled almost entirely, a small plant that had somehow survived 3 weeks of nobody watering it, and a coffee mug that had been a gift from a colleague who had left the company 2 years before I did, and I walked back toward the exit. Mr. Harmon was not in the office when I left. Whether that was deliberate on his part or simply coincidental, I found that I genuinely did not care either way. Cody was there. He was sitting at his workstation, staring at his monitor with the focused expression of someone working very hard to understand something difficult. When I passed his desk, he looked up immediately. "I'm sorry," he said. "For whatever that's worth. I didn't know what I was being put in the middle of when I took this." I stopped walking. "I know you didn't," I said. "Take care of yourself, Cody." I meant that completely. Then I walked through the front entrance of Harlow Tech for the last time, stepped out into the open air, and did not look back once. 6 months later, I heard what had happened to the company. I wasn't tracking it on purpose. The information reached me the way these things always eventually do, through a former colleague who still sent me occasional messages, and through the kind of quiet professional network where news travels faster than anyone intends it to. Harlow Tech had outsourced the entire legacy platform to an external engineering firm. The contract had cost them more money in the first quarter alone than my complete 6-year salary had cost them over my entire time there. The external team spent months stabilizing things well enough to hold the enterprise clients in place. Most of the enterprise clients reduced their contracts anyway. Cody had left within his first month after I walked out. I heard he went back to finish his degree, which was probably the most sensible decision anyone at that company made during that entire period. Mr. Harmon was no longer with the company. No further details reached me beyond that, and I did not go looking for them. As for me, I spent those 6 months building something of my own. A small consultancy working with clients I chose on contracts I negotiated on my own terms from the very beginning. No one could ever slide my work across a table to someone else, because this time everything I built belonged entirely to me. And after 6 years of quiet, invisible, thankless work, I finally knew down to my bones exactly what that work was worth.